April 8th, 1943. 27,000 feet above Caen, France. The air is thin and freezing at this altitude. Inside the tight cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190, Oberleutnant Rolf Herrmichen adjusts his oxygen mask. He is a predator, a veteran ace of the legendary Jagdgeschwader 26. He looks down through his crystal-clear canopy, scanning for the enemy. And then he starts laughing. He keys his radio, his voice crackling with mockery.
"The Amies," he sneers to his wingman. "They have sent us flying milk bottles. Welcome to WW2 History Reel." What the German ace was looking at was the combat debut of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. To the Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to their sleek, deadly Messerschmitts, these American machines looked ridiculous. They were massive, barrel-shaped. They weighed 7 tons, twice as much as a Spitfire. They looked like they shouldn't even be able to fly, let alone fight. Herrmichen smirked behind his mask. He thought he was looking at target practice, but he was wrong. Dead wrong. What he didn't know, what none of the German pilots circling like wolves could imagine, was that they were witnessing the arrival of their own extinction. They weren't milk bottles. They were flying tanks. And hidden inside those massive wings were 8 .50 caliber heavy machine guns.
A battery of destruction capable of firing 6,000 rounds per minute. That is enough concentrated lead to saw a German plane in half in less than 2 seconds. The Luftwaffe laughed on that day in April, but within 18 months, the laughter would stop. The P-47 would become the most terrifying sound in the skies of Europe. The transformation of the air war began that very morning. Major Donald Blakesley, the battle-hardened commander of the 335th Fighter Squadron, looked up and saw the German wolves positioning for the kill. Blakesley was unique. He was a veteran of the Eagle squadrons. He had flown the elegant, agile RAF Spitfire. He looked at the massive beast he was now flying, and he realized the terrifying truth. He knew that if his men tried to fly the P-47 like a Spitfire, if they tried to turn, twist, and dance with the Germans, they would die. The Thunderbolt was not built for a duel. It was built for a massacre. While the Germans built lightweight fencers, Republic Aviation had built a high-altitude sledgehammer. It used mass, brute force, and terrifying speed to crush the enemy. But on that morning in April, the odds were suicidal. There were 56 American pilots in the sky. They were future legends, but on that day, they were rookies. They had been in combat for exactly 0 days. Facing them were the veterans of the Luftwaffe, men who had been killing since 1939, men who had survived the skies of Poland, France, and Russia. This wasn't just a battle of pilots. It was a battle of philosophies. The P-47 was born from panic. In 1940, as the Nazis swept across Europe, the U.S. Army Air Corps demanded a weapon that could stop them. Their chief designer, the brilliant Alexander Kartveli, didn't give them a normal plane. He sketched a monster. He looked at his design team and admitted the truth. "It will be a dinosaur," he said, "but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." When the prototype first rolled out of the hangar, it shocked everyone who saw it. It didn't look like a fighter. It looked like an experiment gone wrong. The machine was a leviathan. At 9,900 pounds empty, it weighed 65% more than the fighter it replaced. It looked bloated, pregnant, and there was a reason for that. Inside its fuselage lay a massive, complex system of ducting for a turbo supercharger.
Test pilots would walk up to it, kick the giant tires, and ask the same question: does this thing actually fly? It did more than fly. It dominated the stratosphere. The heart of the beast was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, a masterpiece of American engineering. While German engines gasped for air at 27,000 feet, the Thunderbolt's turbo supercharger forced oxygen into the engine, allowing it to scream at full power where other planes stalled. But power comes with a price. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke, the legendary commander of the 56th Fighter Group, initially hated the plane. Why? Because it was a man-killer. During training in Connecticut, the 56th was decimated. Between September 1942 and January 1943, they lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft. Think about that. In those early, dark days. The P-47 killed more Americans than the Germans did. It was unforgiving. It would spin out on landing. The torque from that massive propeller could flip the plane upside down on takeoff if you weren't careful. And in a dive, it fell so fast that pilots encountered a terrifying new phenomenon called compressibility. The air would turn into concrete. The controls would freeze. And the pilot would ride the machine straight into the ground. But for those who survived the training, like a young farm boy from Oklahoma named Robert Johnson, the P-47 was a revelation. Johnson, who would go on to become one of America's greatest aces, described his first flight with awe. "It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive," he said. "The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it, you aimed it." In the spring of 1943, the Germans felt invincible. The first dogfights confirmed every prejudice they held. The P-47 was sluggish. It couldn't turn with a Focke-Wulf 190. It couldn't climb with a Messerschmitt 109. If you dragged it down to medium altitude, it was a sitting duck. Hauptmann Josef Pips Priller, the legendary commander of Jagdgeschwader 26, sent a gleeful report back to headquarters. He called the new American fighter meat for the slaughter. He wrote, "It flies like a truck, it turns like a freight train, and it climbs like a pregnant cow." To the German aces, these fat targets were a joke. Even the British allies were skeptical. RAF pilots, flying their nimble Spitfires, looked at the massive American tub and made cruel jokes. They said the best evasive maneuver in a Thunderbolt was to unstrap your seatbelt. The statistics seemed to prove them right. In the first month, the Americans lost 14 Thunderbolts. The Germans lost only 3 planes. But beneath the statistics, something strange was happening. Something the Germans failed to notice until it was too late. The P-47s that went down didn't go down easy. They absorbed an insane amount of punishment. One aircraft limped home on May 4th with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes shattering its skin. That kind of damage would have disintegrated a Spitfire. It would have turned a Messerschmitt into a fireball. But the Thunderbolt, its massive radial engine, had no fragile coolant system to leak. It just kept running. And then there was the firepower. German pilots were used to short bursts, but when a P-47 pulled the trigger,
it unleashed a convergence zone of destruction. 8 heavy machine guns focusing their fire into a single point. It wasn't just shooting, it was erasing. June 26, 1943. Over the skies of Forges-les-Eaux, France. This is the moment the legend was born. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson is flying Tail End Charlie, the vulnerable last man in the formation. Suddenly, the sun blinks out. 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from the elite I-Gruppe Jagdgeschwader 26 drop out of the glare.
Leading them is Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, the brother of the famous German general of fighters. They execute a perfect ambush. In seconds, Johnson's world turns into a hell of noise and fire. He is caught in a brutal crossfire. 21 20-millimeter cannon shells slam into his aircraft. Think about that. A single 20-millimeter shell can tear a wing off a Spitfire. Johnson takes 21 of them. The cockpit explodes. Hydraulic fluid sprays everywhere, blinding him.
The engine cowling is ripped off. Fire erupts behind the dashboard, cooking his legs. Shrapnel tears into his nose and hands. Panic sets in. He has to get out. Now. He unbuckles, grabs the canopy handle, and pulls. Nothing. He pulls again, screaming with adrenaline. It won't budge. A German shell has exploded right in the canopy track, welding the metal shut. He is trapped. He is burning. And he is falling from 27,000 feet. But then,
a miracle. The fire flickers out. The massive Pratt & Whitney engine, though shaking violently, keeps turning. Johnson, covered in oil and blood, manages to level the plane. He points the nose toward England. Any other fighter, a Zero, a Messerschmitt, a Spitfire, would be falling debris by now. But the Thunderbolt is still flying. Johnson takes a breath. He thinks he might survive, but he is wrong. It is about to get much, much worse. A lone predator spots him.
A Focke-Wulf 190, flown by a German ace, drops down on Johnson's crippled plane. The American is a sitting duck, limping toward the English Channel at just 170 miles per hour. He has no canopy, no hydraulics, and he is bleeding. What happens next defies the laws of physics. The German slides in behind him. He pulls the trigger. Boom! 4 20-millimeter cannons and 2 heavy machine guns unload into the Thunderbolt.
Johnson huddles behind his armored seat, listening to the shells hammering his fuselage like a sledgehammer on a trash can. But the plane doesn't fall. The German runs out of cannon shells. He can't believe it. He repositions and fires his machine guns.
Hundreds of rounds tear into the American fighter. It still won't fall. Now, out of ammo and frustrated, the German pilot pulls up alongside Johnson. They are wingtip to wingtip. Johnson looks to his side.
He sees the enemy. He sees a young, blonde German ace. But the German isn't smiling anymore. His expression has shifted from arrogance to confusion, to fear. He is looking at a ghost. The German shakes his head in disbelief. He gives a small, respectful salute to the man who refuses to die, and peels away. Johnson lands his wreck at an RAF base in Manston.
The plane dies the moment the wheels touch the grass. The ground crew tries to count the bullet holes, but they stop counting after 200. One cannon shell had exploded inches from Johnson's head. Another hit the armor plate right behind his spine. The engine had taken direct hits. The structural backbone of the plane was severed. By all rights, Robert Johnson should be dead. But the jug brought him home. And back in Germany, the intelligence reports were starting to sound like horror stories. Back in England, American engineers stared at Johnson's wrecked plane in silence. They realized they hadn't just built a fighter. They had built a flying tank. But durability wasn't enough. To win, they had to kill. Enter Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke. The commander of the 56th Fighter Group was a tactical genius. He looked at his massive 7-ton beast and realized something the Germans hadn't. That weight wasn't a weakness. It was a weapon. Zemke drilled a new rule into his pilots. Never turn with a Messerschmitt. Never dogfight on their terms. Instead, he taught them to use gravity. Because it was so heavy, the P-47 dropped like a stone. From 30,000 feet, a pilot could roll inverted and dive. The speedometer would scream past 550 miles per hour. At that speed, the Thunderbolt broke the laws of aerial combat.
No German fighter could catch it. If they tried to follow, their lighter wings would rip off. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin refined this into a brutal art form. It was called boom and zoom. The Americans would climb high into the stratosphere, waiting like hawks. When they saw the Germans below, they would dive. They would hit the enemy before they even knew they were there. And the result was terrifying.
When a diving P-47 opened fire, it wasn't a dogfight. It was an execution. German pilots who survived described it as flying into a wall of lead. The kinetic energy of the dive, combined with 8 heavy machine guns, didn't just shoot planes down, it disintegrated them. Wings sheared off, fuselages snapped. The flying milk bottle had become the juggernaut. August 17th, 1943. The sky over Germany turns black with flak. It is the infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid.
The Americans are pushing deeper into the Reich than ever before. High above the bombers, Major David Schilling of the 62nd Fighter Squadron spots a target-rich environment. Below him is a formation of Messerschmitt 110s, the twin-engine destroyers armed with rockets designed to butcher the B-17s. Schilling doesn't hesitate. He rolls his flight of 4 Thunderbolts over and dives. Unteroffizier Heinrich Roth, a rear gunner in one of the German planes,
watches them come down.
He later described it in an interrogation room. They came down like hammers from heaven. Roth opens fire. He sees his bullets sparking off the thick wing of the leading Thunderbolt, but the American plane doesn't even wobble. It just keeps coming. Then, the Thunderbolt opens fire. The result is sickening. The German plane in front of Roth doesn't just crash, it evaporates. The fuselage snaps in two. The wings tear off. The cockpit and the men inside are shredded into what Roth called metal confetti. In less than 60 seconds, 8 German heavy fighters are erased from the sky. The Luftwaffe had never seen firepower like this. The P-47 carried 3,400 rounds of ammunition, but the secret was the convergence zone. Mechanics set B-8 guns to cross their streams at exactly 300 yards. At that specific point, the air is filled with 100 armor-piercing projectiles per second.
If a German pilot flew through that 6-foot zone, he didn't just get hit, he ceased to exist. The Americans didn't just have more guns, they had better bullets. While German pilots had to count every shell, the Americans loaded a cocktail of destruction, armor-piercing incendiaries mixed with tracers. They were designed to punch through steel and then set everything inside on fire.
Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, the man who would become the top American ace in Europe, saw the results firsthand. When you hit them with all 8, he said, they don't just go down, they explode. He once watched a Messerschmitt 109 get cut cleanly in half. The tail went one way, the burning cockpit went the other. But by September 1943, the Luftwaffe faced a new problem: altitude.
The P-47 had a turbo supercharger the size of a small car inside its belly. At 30,000 feet, where the air is thin, the German engines were gasping for oxygen. But the Thunderbolt? It was just getting started. On October 8, 1943, this technological gap claimed a legend. Oberstlieutenant Hans Philipp was a god among pilots. He had 206 confirmed kills. He was leading Jagdgeschwader 1 over Bremen to intercept American bombers. But at 28,000 feet, his Focke-Wulf 190 was sluggish.
It was drowning in the thin air. Suddenly, the 56th Fighter Group dropped from the sun. Robert Johnson, the same pilot who had survived the slaughter months earlier, was now the predator. He spotted Philippe's distinctive plane. The fight didn't last long. Johnson's report was cold and clinical. Opened fire at 300 yards. Observed strikes along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. There was no parachute. The Luftwaffe was shocked. If the Thunderbolt could kill Hans Philippe,
Then nobody was safe. The death of Hans Philipp shook the Luftwaffe to its core. If a Thunderbolt could kill one of Germany's greatest aces, what chance did the rookies have? Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring demanded answers. The report that landed on his desk in November 1943 was a horror story for the German High Command. The Americans weren't just lucky. The machine was superior.
The report stated the P-47 could fly higher than any German fighter, up to 42,000 feet. Its dive speed was flirting with the sound barrier. And it was armored like a tank. A solid steel plate protected the pilot's back. The engine was shielded. It could absorb damage that would destroy 3 Messerschmitts and still fly home. But in January 1944, a new nightmare arrived. The paddle blade propeller. It was a massive 13-foot Hamilton Standard prop.
The blades were wider, shaped like giant oars to bite into the thin air. Suddenly, the heavy beast could climb. Hauptmann Heinz Noka of Jagdgeschwader 11 found this out the hard way. In February 1944, he tried to escape a flight of Thunderbolts by climbing, a tactic that had always worked before. But this time, the Americans followed him up. Noka wrote in his diary, "They followed us to 30,000 feet. Schmidt was caught and blown apart."
Nothing left but smoke and fragments. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year. And then there was the noise. The tips of those massive new propeller blades broke the sound barrier. They created a unique, terrifying roar that could be heard from miles away. The German troops on the ground learned to fear it. They gave it a new name. They called it Donnerschlag, thunderclap.
By March 1944, the map of the war changed. The Americans figured out how to hang massive fuel tanks under the P-47's wings. Suddenly, the short-legged fighter could fly over 1,000 miles. It could escort the bombers all the way to Berlin. The Luftwaffe's strategy was simple. Ignore the fighters. Kill the bombers. But flying through a screen of P-47s became a suicide mission. Major Gunther Rall was one of the deadliest men in the sky.
He was the 3rd highest-scoring ace in history, with 275 confirmed kills. He had survived the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. But on March 6, 1944, he met the Thunderbolt. He later recalled the moment vividly. "We saw them above us," Rall said, "fat silhouettes against the sun." Someone on the radio laughed and said, "Here come the flying pigs." But nobody was laughing 30 seconds later. The Americans dropped their tanks and dove. Rall described it as an avalanche. They fell faster than the Germans could react. "The first pass destroyed 3 of our fighters," Rall remembered. "Just gone, transformed into burning debris." Rall realized too late that the American guns were different. German cannons fired slow, thumping bursts, but the 8 machine guns of the P-47 poured out a solid, continuous stream of lead. Getting caught in that stream, Rall said, meant instant death.
That day, the legendary ace was shot down and lost his thumb. He was lucky. Most of his comrades didn't make it to the ground alive. By the spring of 1944, the P-51 Mustang arrived to take over the high-altitude escort duties. But the Thunderbolt didn't retire. It went down into the mud. It found a new calling: ground attack. The P-47 became the Jabo, short for Jag Bomber. And for the German soldier on the ground, it became the ultimate terror. The Americans realized that the Thunderbolt's massive engine could lift an insane amount of ordnance. They strapped 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings, then a 500-pounder under the belly. Suddenly, a single fighter plane was carrying the same bomb load as a medium bomber. But the real game changer was the HVAR,
the high-velocity aircraft rocket. Each rocket packed the punch of a 105mm artillery shell.
Oberst Hans von Luck, a legendary commander of the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, faced this fury in Normandy. He later wrote about the horror of being caught in the open. "They came in low," von Luck recalled, "so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound alone broke men's spirits. The roar of the radial engine, the scream of the rockets, and then the rhythmic hammer of 8 machine guns tearing the earth apart."
Von Luck watched helplessly as a column of his trucks simply ceased to exist. 20 vehicles were turned into burning scrap metal in a single pass. The psychological effect was devastating, he said. They were flying artillery with the accuracy of snipers. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The Luftwaffe tried to stop the invasion, but they ran into a wall. Over 500 P-47s formed an impenetrable steel umbrella over the beaches of Normandy.
They were stacked in layers, from the waves up to the stratosphere. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of the elite Jagdgeschwader II was one of the few German pilots who even saw the beaches that day. His report was the sound of defeat. "The sky belonged to the Americans," Fischer said. "We tried to break through at dawn with 12 fighters. I was the only one to return." He described a suffocating trap. You couldn't climb over the Thunderbolts.
You couldn't dive under them. If you tried, their massed guns turned your plane into what he called aluminum rain. But the real slaughter happened after D-Day. The P-47s began a systematic campaign to starve the German army. They hunted anything that moved. In June alone, the Jugs of the 9th Air Force destroyed 651 locomotives and nearly 4,000 trucks. They blew up 500 tanks and slaughtered 4,000 horse-drawn wagons. The Wehrmacht, the army that invented Blitzkrieg, was paralyzed. They were forced to become creatures of the night. If a German column tried to move during the day, it died. They tried adding armor to their trucks. They tried adding more flak guns. It didn't matter. The P-47 was too fast, too tough, and too heavily armed. The flying milk bottle had closed the roads of Europe. While the P-47 was breaking the Luftwaffe in Europe, it was also hunting in the Pacific.
But here, the enemy was different. The Japanese Zeros were agile, paper-thin dancers. The American commanders thought the heavy Thunderbolt would be too slow to fight them. Colonel Neil Kirby, the aggressive commander of the 348th Fighter Group, proved them wrong. Kirby knew he couldn't turn with a Zero, so he didn't. He used the P-47's massive engine to climb high above the jungle canopy of New Guinea, waiting like a hawk. Then he would dive. On October 11th, 1943, over the Japanese base at Wewak, Kirby demonstrated the power of this tactic. Leading just 4 P-47s against 40 Japanese fighters, he didn't retreat. He slashed through them. In a single mission, he shot down 6 enemy planes, earning the Medal of Honor. The Japanese were in shock. They were used to fighting fragile Wildcats, but this new plane, it was a nightmare.
Saburo Sakai, the legendary Japanese ace who never lost the dogfight, later wrote with horror about meeting the Thunderbolt. "We called them monsters," Sakai admitted. "Our 20mm cannons, which could vaporize a P-40 with a few hits, seemed to bounce off them. I pumped dozens of rounds into one Thunderbolt and just watched it fly away." And the P-47 kept evolving. To conquer the vast Pacific Ocean, engineers built the ultimate version, the P-47N. They filled its wings with fuel, extending its range to over 2,000 miles. Now, the Jug could escort B-29 bombers all the way to Tokyo. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe played its final card: the future. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It could scream through the sky at 540 miles per hour. It should have been untouchable by any propeller plane. But the P-47 pilots discovered a flaw in the physics of the jet age.
The German jets were fast, but they took forever to accelerate, and they couldn't turn. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group proved that the old dinosaur could still hunt. He spotted a jet below him. He didn't try to chase it. He tipped his heavy Thunderbolt over and let gravity do the work. In the dive, the P-47 hit 500 miles per hour. The German pilot, confident in his superior technology, never checked his 6. He never saw the 7-ton sledgehammer falling on him. Meyer opened fire at 400 yards. The result was catastrophic. "The enemy aircraft disintegrated," Meyer wrote. "Both engines ripped off the fuselage." To hunt these new threats, the Americans built the ultimate hot rod, the P-47M. They injected water methanol into the engine, boosting it to a terrifying 2,800 horsepower. It was designed to chase down V-1 flying bombs and jets. Major George Bostwick used this beast to kill 2 jets in March 1945. His report revealed the brutal truth. "The jets are faster," Bostwick admitted, "but they can't turn, and they can't take punishment. One good burst from our battery, and they come apart like they are made of paper." January 1st, 1945. New Year's Day. The Luftwaffe gambles everything on one final, desperate throw of the dice. Operation Bodenplatte. 900 German fighters launch a surprise dawn attack on Allied airfields across Europe. At Airfield Y-34 near Metz, the home of the 365th Fighter Group, it looks like a massacre. German fighters strafe the parked rows. 22 Thunderbolts are turned into burning wrecks. In the chaos, a German pilot is shot down and captured. He is dragged to the command post, defiant. He points a gloved hand at the burning American planes and sneers at the base commander, Major George Brooking. "What do you think of that?" the German taunts. "We have destroyed you." Major Brooking doesn't get angry. He just points to the flight line, where bulldozers are already pushing the wreckage aside to make room. He looks the German in the eye and delivers the sentence of death for the Third Reich. "By tomorrow," Brooking says coldly, "I will have 40 new planes. But tell me, How long will it take you to replace your pilots? The smirk vanishes from the German's face. Brooking wasn't bluffing. Within 48 hours, the airfield was full again. Factory-fresh P-47s arrived from England like a swarm of angry bees. The Germans didn't understand what they were fighting. They were fighting a monster of production.
In Indiana, a factory built on empty farmland was churning out 500 Thunderbolts a month. At the peak, Republic Aviation was finishing a new fighter plane every single hour. The numbers were staggering. It wasn't just about building the planes, it was about feeding them. Every time a P-47 took off, it was hungry. By mid-1944, the Thunderbolts of the 9th Air Force alone were spitting out over 10 million rounds of ammunition every single month.
In Missouri, the Lake City Arsenal was running 24 hours a day, producing 30 million cartridges a month. And these weren't mass-produced junk. Each bullet was machined to a tolerance of 1/10,000th of an inch. They never jammed. They just killed. And the fuel? A single P-47 burned 100 gallons an hour just cruising. In combat, with the water injection engaged, it gulped 300 gallons. The 9th Air Force consumed 25 million gallons of high-octane aviation fuel a month.
A river of oil shipped across the Atlantic, protected by the U.S. Navy. But the greatest weapon America produced wasn't made of aluminum or steel. It was flesh and blood. By 1944, the pilot disparity was tragic. The United States was graduating 30,000 pilots a year. Before a P-47 pilot ever saw a German, he had flown for at least 400 hours. He knew navigation, he knew gunnery, he knew formation flying. The German he was fighting?
By late in the war, the average Luftwaffe rookie was thrown into the cockpit with less than 100 hours. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts arrived in England in September 1944. He realized immediately that it wasn't a fair fight. "I had 420 hours in my logbook," Roberts recalled. "I had fired at towed targets. I studied gun camera film. My first mission, I knew exactly what to do." The German pilot I faced couldn't have had half my experience. It wasn't a duel, it was murder. March 1945. The end is near. German propaganda officers arrive to interview Oberstleutnant Josef Priller. They want a heroic soundbite to boost morale. They are talking to the same man who 2 years earlier had laughed at the flying milk bottles. But Priller isn't laughing anymore. He gives them a statement so depressing, so brutally honest, that the Nazis refuse to publish it. "The Thunderbolt," Priller admitted, "is the best fighter bomber ever built." He described a machine that never jammed, never overheated, and seemed to have infinite ammunition. But his fear went deeper than the machine. He realized he wasn't fighting a plane, he was fighting a factory. "They lose 10 planes," Priller said, "and they build 20. We lose 1, and it is gone forever." He looked at the young, untrained German boys dying around him and compared them to the Americans.
Their pilots arrive better trained than our instructors. They have fuel. They have spare parts. We have nothing but courage. And courage without resources is just delayed defeat. His final words were a eulogy for the Luftwaffe. We laughed at them in 1943. We are not laughing now. When you hear those guns.
By April 1945, the Luftwaffe existed mostly on paper. The fuel was gone. The airfields were craters. But a few desperate men still tried to fly. Feldwebel Klaus Brettschneider was one of the last pilots trained by the Third Reich. He flew exactly one combat mission before the war ended. It lasted 12 seconds.
Over the burning city of Leipzig, he looked up and saw 4 P-47s diving on him. They were in perfect formation. I tried to turn, Brettschneider recalled, but they were too fast.
In less than 60 seconds, the American Thunderbolts destroyed his entire squadron. The sky, he said, was raining burning aluminum and bodies. The psychological impact on the Germans was absolute. Medical officers began to report a new condition among the troops. They called it Jabo fever. Even veteran pilots who had survived the Eastern Front would become physically ill, vomiting and shaking, before a mission against the P-47s. On the ground, the panic was even worse.
The deep, distinctive roar of the Thunderbolt's engine meant death was coming. The final scorecard was staggering. In Europe alone, the P-47s claimed 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, and 68,000 trucks. They didn't just defeat the German army. They dismantled it, piece by piece. The numbers tell the story of a slaughter. For every Thunderbolt lost in combat, nearly 5 German planes were destroyed. It was the lowest loss rate of any fighter bomber in the war.
But behind the cold mathematics lay a human tragedy. By the end of the war, the Luftwaffe had lost 28,000 pilots on the Western Front. The men inside the German cockpits were no longer the aces of 1940. They were children. By 1945, the average German pilot had less than 30 hours of flight time. They were being sent up to fight American veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience. It wasn't a war anymore. It was target practice.
After the surrender, the Allies captured the archives of the Luftwaffe Interrogation Center at Oberursel. Inside, they found a secret file tracking their assessment of the P-47. Reading it today shows the slow, creeping realization of doom. April 1943. The report calls the P-47 large, unmaneuverable, inferior to German types. Assessment: minimal threat. December 1943. The tone changes. Exceptional high-altitude performance. Extreme structural strength. Assessment: significant threat above 25,000 feet. June 1944. Panic sets in. Dominant fighter bomber.
Firepower, devastating, extremely difficult to shoot down. Assessment, critical threat at all altitudes. And finally, March 1945. The German intelligence officers wrote the final epitaph for their own Air Force. Assessment, unsurvivable, in direct engagement. 40 years later, in 1985, the ghosts of the air war met in Phoenix, Arizona. It was a reunion of former enemies. Among them stood General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, the legendary head of the Luftwaffe fighter arm.
When asked about the P-47, the old ace stopped smiling. He admitted a truth that had haunted him for decades. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943, Galland said. "We saw this big, heavy fighter, and we laughed. We thought the Americans had built a bomber and called it a fighter." He shook his head. "We were the ones who didn't understand."
Galland explained that while the Germans were obsessed with elegance, the Americans understood the brutal math of war. They built a machine designed for attrition, a plane that could take a beating and keep killing. They were right, Galland admitted. "The first time I flew a captured P-47, I understood. It climbed like it was falling upward. It was a pilot's aircraft, wrapped in tank armor." But what truly terrified Galland wasn't the plane itself.
It was the industry behind it. America built 15,000 of these complex machines while fighting a two-ocean war, he said. Each engine was a masterpiece. Yet they built them faster than we could build simple fighters. That is when I knew we never had a chance. He then recalled the sound of the 8 machine guns firing at once. The Germans had a special nickname for it. They called it Roosevelt's piano.
"Once you heard that sound," Galland said softly, "you never forgot it. Many of my friends heard it for the last time." Even after the war, some stubborn German veterans argued that their fighters were technically better. They claimed they were only overwhelmed by numbers. But the combat records tell a different story. The P-47's 8 machine guns were not inferior to German cannons. They were smarter. A German 20mm cannon hit hard, but it fired slowly.
You had to be a sniper to hit a twisting target. The Thunderbolt was different. It didn't need to snipe. It created a probability cloud of lead. A 2-second burst put 20 armor-piercing incendiary rounds into the enemy. The incendiary chemicals burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It didn't matter where you hit them. If you touched them, they burned. Today, at the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47D sits silently in the hangar.
Next to the plane, there is a small glass display case. Inside, there is a strip of grainy gun camera film showing a Focke-Wulf 190 disintegrating. And below that, there is a quote from a captured German pilot interrogated in 1945. It sums up the entire war. "We laughed when we first saw them," the pilot said. "Fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn.
They just pointed those guns at you, and you ceased to exist." The P-47 Thunderbolt started the war as a joke. It ended it as the most feared predator in the sky. The Luftwaffe laughed in April 1943. By May 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The thunder had spoken, and the sky belonged to America.